Greetings, Torah scholars! Welcome back to Advanced Judaism for Beginners, continuing on the topic of the mitzvah of settling the land of Eretz Israel. Welcome back again. I missed you all. We discussed this topic first by discussing whether recounting the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel as part of the 613 mitzvot that are listed in the Torah or not. We brought that argument between Maimonides and Nachmanides. We also continue to explain the position of the religious anti-Zionists, to see their sources in the Talmud and other halachic sources, to understand how did they come to their current position as religious anti-Zionists. In the last few videos, we discussed Rabbi Joel of Teitelbaum. And now, before we're going to go to the position of the religious Zionists and see their sources in the Torah and Halacha, etc., what I thought it would be a good idea is to give a very brief overview, the historic overview of what occurred in the land of Israel from the 2nd century through the 18th century. I thought before jumping to the religious Zionist perspective, and that's going to start from the movement of Chovevei Tzion in the 18th century. So before we jump to that position, then I just wanted to give an overview of what occurred in the land of Israel, again, between the 2nd century through the 17th century. And what we will see is that during that time, though by far most Jews lived in the diaspora, and most of the Jewish centers were in the diaspora, still, for majority of that time, remained a very strong community within the land of Israel. And indeed, there were many Jewish achievements in terms of religious accomplishments that occurred in the land of Israel and contributed to the Jewish life throughout those centuries, even while most Jews were in the diaspora. We're also going to see throughout that time that there were many Jews who either made aliyah, did their ascent to the land of Israel, or attempted to do aliyah to the land of Israel, either as individual, as some sort of a religious retirement, or part of a movement. And we're also going to see during that time that the reason for various shifts in Jewish populations to and from the land of Israel occurred due to various reasons, either economic reasons, or due to various persecutions, or due to various messianic or religious motives to go back to the land of Israel. So this is what we're going to see with Hashem's help in this video. So now let's jump straight to it. 2nd century. Now, in the 1st and 2nd century, we have what is called the Judea-Roman Wars that occurred in the land of Israel. And indeed, the 1st century, the Second Temple was destroyed. And in the 2nd century, we had, after the temple was destroyed, about 70 years after the temple was destroyed, we had what is called the Bar Kokhba Revolt as part of the Judea-Roman Wars. What's interesting point about that is that even after the temple was destroyed in the 1st century, there were still many Jews remaining in the land of Israel and indeed in Jerusalem, and also they prospered there, both materialistically, economically speaking, and also spiritually. However, by the 2nd century, in the revolt of Bar Kokhba, the Roman response to it was so harsh, was so devastating, and far more devastating in many ways than the actual destruction of the temple a century prior to that. Then that really, in the 2nd century, that really accelerated the movement of Jews from the land of Israel to the diaspora. And indeed, part of the response of the Roman Empire to the Bar Kokhba Revolt, there were much destructions to the cities of the land of Israel, enslavement of the many Jews, and indeed after that, Jews were mostly prohibited from entering Jerusalem after the Bar Kokhba Revolt. Also interesting, that's when the Romans changed the name of the colony of Judea, what they called the province of Judea, to Palestine. Now, what's interesting, I should say at that time was the province of Palestine. Now, what's interesting is that, where did the Romans get that name? A millennia earlier, the arch enemies of the Jews were the Philistines. The Philistines were the enemies of the Jews, a nation that lived around the coast of Israel, mainly the southern coast of Israel. And indeed in the book of Judges, mainly in the book of Samuel as well, there are recordings of a lot of mostly negative interactions between the Philistines and the Jews. And indeed a millennia later, after the revolt of Bar Kokhba, the Romans renamed the province of Judea to the province of Palestine, again, Palestina, I should say, naming it after the arch enemies of the Jews from the time of Judges. So again, what that, in the 2nd century, that indeed caused Jews to further move away from the land of Israel to the diaspora. And at that point, majority of Jews lived in either Babylon, which again, many Jews already remained there from the first temple, but now whoever moved to the land of Israel moved back, generations later moved back to Babylon, to Egypt, to Syria, to many cities throughout the Mediterranean. So this indeed what the Roman-Judea wars caused. But there were still many Jewish communities remaining in the land of Israel, and especially in the north of Israel, in the Galilee, in the cities of Tzipori, of Tiberias. And the Jewish center that lived in the Galilee of Israel eventually became the life behind the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was compiled in the 4th and 5th centuries, and it essentially similar to its counterpart, the Babylon Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was recordings of various conversations that occurred in the yeshivot, in the study halls in the land of Israel, again, mainly in the cities of Tiberias, of Tzipori, also of Caesarea. So we see that even through the 4th and 5th centuries, when the Jerusalem Talmud was compiled, there were still many yeshivot and very central yeshivot existing in the land of Israel. Now again, it wasn't as important, halachically speaking, and in terms of size, as its counterpart in Babylon. It was not, and indeed today, the Babylon Talmud has a far more weight in Halacha than the Jerusalem Talmud, for different reasons, because the Babylon Talmud has more debates, more conversations, it's much more expansive. So generally there's more discussions there of Halacha, as opposed to the Jerusalem Talmud, which is more concise and it's shorter. So therefore it's harder for us to derive certain aspect of Halacha from there. Nevertheless, we see how the Jerusalem Talmud was compiled in the land of Israel centuries after the destruction of the Second Temple and centuries after Bar Kokhba Revolt. Now, let's continue down the line of the historic line in our tunnel, historic tunnel that we're traveling through. And through the 7th and 10th centuries, what we have in the land of Israel are Baalei HaMasorah, the Masoretes, if I'm translating it correctly and pronouncing it correctly. Now, Baalei HaMasorah, I do want to say that I actually I heard about them before, but I learned more about them as I was doing the research for this video. And Baalei HaMasorah were rabbis that lived in the land of Israel, mainly in the land of Israel at that time, again, 7th to the 10th centuries. And they lived mostly in Tiberias, also some in Jerusalem. And their big contribution to the Jewish life that we know of as today is that they standardized the text, the language Hebrew that we know of today, the Holy Tongue, I should say. Namely, they standardized the Nekud, the vowel markings that we have today in Hebrew, the Komatz, the Patach, all these vowels markings that we have today in Hebrew. Prior to the Baal HaMasorah, there were various grammatic rules and traditions, various customs among the Jewish people. And the Baal HaMasorah, they standardized those Nekud and the text and many, many grammar rules that we have today in the Holy Tongue. In Lashon HaKodesh, it was standardized by these rabbis, Baal HaMasorah, from the 7th through the 10th centuries. So indeed, we see from this is that well after the destruction of the temple, well after most Jews lived already and flourished in the diaspora, there was still a core of a Jewish community and Jewish centers, Torah centers within the land of Israel. Now, jumping to the 12th and 13th centuries, we have what seems to me like the first or one of the first mass migration of rabbis to the land of Israel. And indeed, this came from Baalei HaTosafot. Baalei HaTosafot, these, in previous videos we discussed Baalei HaTosafot, this group of rabbis. And essentially, there were rabbis that lived in that era in 12th and 13th centuries, mostly in Europe, in France, in Germany, some in England and in Italy. And today they're mostly known for their commentary on the Talmud. But indeed, there was a group of 300 rabbis from Baalei HaTosafot from the 12th and 13th centuries, and that they immigrated, and some attempted to, some successfully emigrated to the land of Israel in the 12th and 13th centuries. Now, by the way, the historical background of that is the Crusades. And again, during that time in the land of Israel, we have various wars between the Christians and the Muslims. They fighting over land, and the land sometimes being transferred back and forth between the two groups. And the Jews were somewhere in the middle there. So Baalei HaTosafot during that era attempted to move, and some successfully, to the land of Israel. One notable mention is Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. Yechiel of Paris, he left France in the year 1242, and he left France after a serious persecution against the Jews in Paris, France, in 1242, where there was after a debate between Christians and Jews, there was a famous burning of the Talmud. A very famous burning of the Talmud. And again, it was a very, very dramatic, and the Jews of that time in France had to endure great hardship. So after that, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, he's one of Baalei HaTosafot, he moved to the land of Israel. So we see from this story, the mass migration of group of 300 rabbis of Baalei HaTosafot to the land of Israel, we see indeed that going back to the land of Israel, it wasn't just a modern phenomenon, as we're going to see once we're going to move to the 18th century. It was also a very old phenomenon. And here is one example from the 13th century. And indeed, moving forward to the 13th century, we have the Mongol Empire invasion to the land of Israel. And by the way, just to hold our head a second, we started this conversation when the land of Israel was ruled in the 2nd century by the Roman Empire. Later, it became the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Empire of the Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire took over the land of Israel. Various wars with the Muslim as the Muslim Empire rose in the Middle East. And now we have the 13th century, we have the Mongols. And the Mongols indeed brought great devastation to many cities throughout the Middle East. There's a famous burning of the city of Baghdad, which already at the 13th century was a big Muslim city, a big center for Muslims. And that devastation by the Mongols also came to the land of Israel. After that, we have a very famous rabbi who immigrated to the land of Israel, Nachmanides. And indeed, Nachmanides writes, he arrived to Jerusalem through Accra, the city of Akko, eventually made it to Jerusalem in the year 1267. He wrote about the great devastation to the life, to the Jewish life that happened in Jerusalem. Again, this is after the Mongols brought their devastation throughout the Middle East. And he indeed writes about how he wasn't even able to find the minyan, a group of 10 Jewish men praying in Jerusalem. And Nachmanides indeed had famous sermons from Akko in Accra, very famous various speeches that he gave there. And interesting, eventually Nachmanides died in the land of Israel, but yet we're not sure exactly where is he buried till today. Now, interesting, Nachmanides himself, I said that he immigrated to the land of Israel. I did not say from where. So actually, Nachmanides came from Barcelona, Spain. And indeed, there also, after he had his famous disputation I believe in the year 1266, against actually a Jew who converted and became Christian, and after that, due to various hardship and persecutions against Nachmanides, he wanted to fulfill his lifetime dream of going back to the Holy Land. And indeed, he eventually made it to the Holy Land. So again, we see from the story of Nachmanides how there were he's a good example of how there were various rabbis throughout the time of the diaspora that either individually or part of a bigger movement moved to the land of Israel to fulfill the mitzvah, either the commandment or living of a Jewish holy life, of going back to the land of Israel, of the zchut, of the merit of living in the land of Israel. And now, from Nachmanides, we're jumping through the 16th century. Now, I do want to say, just one side mention, during this period of time, there were also many Karaites, and also came a little bit earlier. Karaites are a group of Jews, and maybe we'll discuss them further in other videos, where essentially they do not believe in what we would call rabbinic Judaism, meaning they did not accept the authority of the sages of Chazal in the way the sages transmitting and interpreting for us the Torah. So there were also Karaites living in the land of Israel. So we see indeed that there was also a diverse crowd being in the land of Israel. Now jumping to the 16th century, we have what is called the Safed Golden Age. Now, how did that come about? After the persecution and then the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and Portugal, starting in the year 1492, so many Jews who left Spain and Portugal immigrated to many parts of the Ottoman Empire. Some went to Europe, some went to the Ottoman Empire, and within the Ottoman Empire to various places under the Ottoman Empire's control. One of them was in Israel, in the land of Israel, and namely, they moved to Safed. Until then, actually, Tzfat, Safed, was not a well-known city in the Jewish world. There is, I believe, one mention of it in the Bible, like a side mention, I believe. Josephus, the historian, mentions it also as a side point. But it really becomes the center that we know of today as one of the four holy cities of the land of Israel. That only became in the 16th century, when many Jews made it to Safed from Spain and Portugal. And there was the golden era for about 100 years, less actually. And unfortunately, after like 80 and 90 years, that golden era of Safed completely diminished and finished after earthquake and diseases, and they left Safed. Now, what happened during that time in the golden age of Safed in the 16th century? There were great flourishing of various aspects of Jewish life, such as mysticism, Kabbalah, being led by the Ramak and his student the Arizal, and they gave us tremendous ideas and books that are a marvel, if that's the right word, till today in Kabbalah. That all occurred in the 16th century in Safed. Also in the aspect of Jewish Halacha, composing the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, that occurred in the 16th century. Jewish law, also great achievement in Jewish poetry, Reb Shlomo El-Kabatz. I think one of the very last prayers that was accepted among all Jewish communities throughout the entire diaspora, Sephardim, Ashkenazim, Yemenites, everyone, is the Lecha Dodi, a prayer in Friday night that all communities sing on Friday nights in synagogues. That is, I think, the very last prayer that everyone accepted. And that was composed in the 16th century in Safed by Reb Shlomo El-Kabatz. So indeed, we see from here, from the story of the gold age of Safed in the 16th century, there was a great Jewish life in the land of Israel, even during the diaspora. Now we're moving to the 17th century. Now we have a little bit more of an infamous story in Europe, the story of Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah, where, again, it's a long story, complicated and fascinating story, but essentially there was a false Messiah who came about in Europe, a false leader, and was actually mainly led by Nathan of Gaza, who eventually did make it to the land of Israel. And during that time, there were various Jews under this false leadership who attempted to move to the land of Israel. So again, we see from here, there was definitely throughout the diaspora, Jews always hoped to return to the land of Israel. And indeed, in the Passover, we say every time, Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year to Jerusalem. In our prayers every day, 3 times a day, we ask God to rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild the land of Israel. And we see indeed, Jews always aspire to go back to the land of Israel. And indeed, this story of the false Messiah, unfortunately, it's one negative episode, part of that phenomenon, but unfortunately a negative episode. Now we're moving, and this is where we're going to finish, and thank you for holding your head. I know we're condensing a lot of history here. We're moving to the 18th and 19th century, 17th and 18th century, where we have the mass migrations of the Hasidim, a Baal Shem Tov, being led by Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, and by the students of the Gra, who were the opponents of the Chassidut, the Misnagdim, also during that time. And these are essentially a group of rabbis. Many of other rabbis attempted to go, for example, the Baal Shem Tov did, but many unsuccessfully. They did not make it to the land of Israel for various reasons. And some did come to the land of Israel. They settled in Tiberias, in Tveria, Jerusalem, and in Hebron, mainly the community of Chabad. And indeed, I do want to mention that throughout most of this history, the economic situation in the land of Israel was dire, and indeed was worse for the average Jew, economically speaking, to live in the land of Israel, far worse than in the diaspora. And indeed, for most of the times, those that moved to the land of Israel, it was not for financial gain. And indeed, during this time, again, the 17th and 18th century, where during the movements of the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, the Talmidei Agra, so they actually started kollels. Kollels essentially at that time is referring to a charitable organization that the money came from abroad, mainly from Europe, to support the Jews living in the land of Israel. And indeed, most of them are named after Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes. He was a rabbi much earlier on, during the Tanaim time in the 2nd century, and we have the tradition that he promised miracles to those that give money to the Jews in the land of Israel. So, jumping to the 17th and 18th century, many kollels that started, charitable organizations that started by the Hasidim, named after that rabbi of the 2nd century, Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes, and this started various organizations to support those movements of the Jews living in Israel. For example, we have Kollel Ungarin. This was a kollel, again, in this context, it's a charitable organization to support Jews coming from Hungary. And then we have for example, a Kollel Shomrei Chomot that started by the Misnagdim, in support of the Misnagdim that lived in the land of Israel. And we also have, of course, in Chabad, Kollel Chabad, started with Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, founded by him. And indeed, founding that and giving charity to the land of Israel that time, what caused them, in some ways, that was one of the reasons why he got in trouble by the Tsarist Russia, and why eventually he was imprisoned and then later freed from prison by giving money to the Jews who lived under the Ottoman control. Ottoman Empire was the enemy of the Tsarist Russia of that time. But anyway, so this is Kollel Chabad, the organization of Chabad in support of the poor that were in Israel. So we see that, again, this I think highlights how for most of this period, the Jews in the diaspora, economically speaking, were usually better than the Jews of the land of Israel. So again, this is it. Thank you everyone for holding your head. We just discussed the history of, just a quick summary, the history of what occurred in the land of Israel from Bar Kokhba Revolt, which that brought the final devastation to most Jews in the land of Israel, and shifted completely what was already happening, but accelerated the Jewish centers moving away from the land of Israel to the diaspora. But we saw that being said, there was still the Jerusalem Talmud came in the 4th and 5th centuries. Then later we see the HaMasorah with their great achievement in the Jewish language, in the standardization of the Jewish language that came from the 7th to the 10th centuries. And then indeed we see the Aliyah of HaTosafot. We see mass migration of 300 rabbis. They moved due to various persecution, and again in their dream to fulfill the zchut and the mitzvah of being in the land of Israel. And we see also indeed individuals like Nachmanides moving to the land of Israel. Then we went to the golden era of Safed. So we see again great flourishing of great communities in the land of Israel that gave so much to the Judaism that we know of today. And indeed, we completed by the discussing Aliyah of the Hasidim and the Talmidei Agra. Thank you everyone. Until the next video.